Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be going through just a photo edit. It's a black and white image. It's going to be pretty easy and pretty chill. I think it's going to be a good time. Raw image looks like this, and I'm going to be taking it to looking like this. Alright, let's hop into it. So it's already open in Lightroom. As you can see, the image is pretty dark. Checking out the histogram here. I'm going to go up to my histogram and pull my exposure up. How I like to use my histogram is I like to blow everything out in either direction, stretch the image as far as I can, and then pull it back to the middle until I have a histogram that looks as close to a wavy table. The way I like to stretch out my light levels involves fully blowing out my highlights, not blowing it out, but pulling it all the way to the right of the histogram, and then squeaking my whites until they just about start to clip, and then stopping before they do clip. As you can see, nothing when I press J is really turning red, except maybe that. So let's pull that back a little bit, these whites, and there, good enough. Pull our shadows down really far. Now, as you can see, it's clipping pretty severely. Don't worry about that because we're gonna pull that back with our black levels and then going back into the shadows and pulling them up until that starts to disappear, right around there. You'll notice like a few kind of dots and everything like that. I wouldn't stress too heavily about this because even if I fully expose the image, that information's not coming back. It's already been lost. Boo-hoo, we'll cry about that later. All right, so here's my wavy table. This is what I mean by a wavy table. It's mostly pretty flat and there's not a whole lot of spikes except at the end, which you can see as demonstrated by this essentially black line right here. In my opinion, this can be a lot more stylish looking. I like my photos to have a little bit of crunch to them, a little bit of texture. My goals for this include darkening a lot of what's around my subject and brightening him up. This is going to be done with masks, and I'll show you kind of what masks I use very consistently. I'll take it a step at a time, don't worry. Our border here is kind of blown out. I don't like the way that looks. I have a white background so I can see where the edges of my image lie. And the reason I do this is if I ever print it, I don't want my whites to blend into the white of the paper at the edge of the image. I want my border of my image to be clearly defined. Okay, so this is an acceptable exposure for now. What can I do to make this image pop? As we can see, there's a light source coming from this general direction, kind of coming down onto the skeleton like that. Okay, so our image is at a nice exposure. I'm going to turn it to my style a little bit. I really like juicy. I like a lot of contrast, a lot of pop. I like everything to be as much of itself as it can be in my image. So if it means there's green in my image, I make it as green as possible, if that makes sense, without making it look like bad. Unrealistic, sure, but bad, I try not to do. Let's do this. So as you'll notice, this skeleton is not really a part of the shadows too much as he is a part of the highlights, and we can see that here. However, when I do this image gets quite spooky scary. Do I want this to be spooky scary? Not really. It was kind of a comedic thing that happened. The pose is too silly for this to be spooky scary. So I'm gonna pull that. I'm gonna make this bright, probably brighter than it should be. Pull these highlights down. Now, the thing with having a bright image like this is it's pretty easy to wash everything out, make everything feel kind of like the same tone. So the way I kind of work around whatever issue I've just created, in this case washing stuff out, is by doing the reverse process of that. So as you see, I've kind of created a small inverse S-curve. I'm just going to do a small S-curve in the shadows, bringing them down just a touch. And now we have, whoa. And now we have a nice contrasty image, also demonstrated in the histogram as more of a puckering peak, as it were. Okay, so my image still kind of looks like garbage. I'm gonna add a linear gradient. And what I'm going to do with this linear gradient is I'm going to make the wall on the left a little less noticeable. The way I'm going to do this is first by getting rid of my visible mask, bringing this way down. Now, you're probably like, oh my god, you totally just ruined it. Don't even worry, because Lightroom has this feature where you can intersect a mask with a luminance range. And what that means is everything that the mask is touching, as we've seen, is this linear gradient. Everything within that range that I've selected with this line and then a little bit of feather, everything within that will be taken into account with this intersect. And what that means is that I'm going to select a luminance value, and that luminance value throughout that entire initial linear gradient range will also be selected, and everything that isn't of that luminance will be discarded from the selection. In practice, it looks like this. Here's my overlay, currently just the linear gradient. Now, if I tell everything within that linear gradient to target just the shadows, you notice everything that's black is going to get selected, but only within the bounds of the linear gradient. Now, I think that doesn't look the way I want it to, because again, I'm trying to darken up the bright spots. So I'm going to take my slider and bring it up to the highlights. I'll start at 100% white and work my way down until there's like a nice feather right around there is good. I want this to be noticeably darker, but not to the point where it looks bad like this. Obviously, I can take it down to about there, and now it's not as noticeable. The reason I'm doing this is so that when I add more masks and more everything, when I apply my edits, general edits, to those masks, it affects everything within them equally. If I have a really bright part of my image and a really dark part of my image, and there's a mask going around that whole section, and I say everything get dark, that super dark section is going to get way darker and not look good. Now everything is kind of uniform, so I'm just going to keep editing, which is kind of good. That's what I want to do. Press enter, get out of that. Okay, so here's my noisy image. I'm going to reduce it just by a touch, probably right about there. And the reason I'm doing just a touch is so I can see these edges a little bit more clearly, but I think my noise gives my image character. Anyway, holy moly, getting super off track. Let's just do some more masking. Alright, so what I'm doing is I'm selecting my skeleton here. I'm going to expose him quite up, probably like right around there. Again, intersecting this mask with a luminance range. I want it to be just to the skeleton. So let's see our luminance selection. So what you'll see is here's our luminance map. So all of the light value in the image of this certain range right here has been taken into account. The show overlay option shows where that luminance selection and that radial gradient overlap. And that's here. As you can see, it's a little bit more than I really wanted. So probably right about there's okay. And before I do anything, I'm going to zoom in. What you'll notice is this selection is really darn harsh. Oops. It'll be okay. Like, don't stress about it. But don't take it too far or else your image is going to look deep fried. I'll take it to right about there. Okay. It's trying to get away with as much as you can without making it look like you've gotten away with some heinous deed. As you can see, our before image and our current image are looking quite different, but kind of the story of the situation is unfolding just a little bit easier to the eyes. Let's keep this thing going. Let's keep this train moving. So I'm gonna add yet another mask. We'll add another mask. And this one is going to be another radial gradient. And the reason I'm doing another radial gradient is because they're awesome. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna select the inverse of the image, or I'm sorry, the inverse of the map, so that when I reduce the exposure, it's everything that isn't covered by that gradient. And then you see, starting to see probably, why I'm choosing to do it this way and maybe not some other way. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna select kind of the area around my guy, like so. I'm just gonna subtract with a brush, which I suppose is slightly easier, whatever. So subtracting all this stuff from our selection, making this seem slightly more natural, which maybe you want, maybe you don't. What I like is including some of these details still. Really darkening this up, until you get something you're happy with. Just think of this as fancy dodging and burning, which if you don't know what that is, I'll show you guys how to dodge and burn and explain it in a different video, but I'm gonna reduce the flow of this so I can slowly add, the shadow back in. As you can see, it's slowly starting to take shape a little bit. I'm kind of molding and caressing my image into something a little different, something that it wasn't. And keep in mind, I'm just using a mouse to paint all this. I would say I use a mouse for probably 99% of my photo editing work. So if that's all you have, that's good enough. Here's our mask. It looks pretty dog water right now because all the exposure is gone. But here's what we can do with this mask. We can start bringing stuff down, really kind of making that selection a little bit more, well, selective. And what I don't really like here is how dark that is becoming. So I'm just gonna and brush that in like so. Okay, brush that in. Brighten things up that I want to be bright, want the people to notice. So that beam is pretty interesting to me. I'm just doing some shift clicking there to make my line straight. Another little trick from Photoshop. Alright, now reduce the flow of our plus brush and really feathering this bad boy out. Now, if you recall, I can do a luminance map on this. So I have made a very specific selection of an area, and now I'm going to make it even more specific by defining a luminance range that I want that area to work with. And my luminance range is probably going to be black, feathered all the way up to white. And what you notice here is now this kind of blends in with our noise, which is splendid. So here is before the luminance range, here's after, and here's before the mask and after. So much more crunch, so much more texture, so much more pop. It looks good. Let's pull that exposure up just a touch, maybe to right about there. It is a little dark over here. Luckily, everything is editable, so I'm just gonna go in here and subtract some of this here. Looks spicy in my opinion. Probably right there is good. Alright. We have a bunch of very lovely grays. That's exactly what we want. To be completely honest, I'm not loving our skeleton mask right now. I'm gonna bring that down just a touch. Probably pump up our highlights instead. What that does is do that. Pump up our whites, crazy, and then bring them down until we have some nice glowy sections. Awesome. Alright, so that's before, that's after. Before, after. There's a lot of other stuff that I can do to this image that I think can continue to improve upon its existence. However, I think it looks fine right there. I'm gonna leave it right there, and maybe I'll post this, maybe I won't. Who's to say? Remember, make your images for you, and if you like it, that's good enough. Peace.